So I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and fellow Center for Communal Studies board member, Dr. Matt Hanka, professor of political science at USI. And Dr. Hanka earned a BA degree in history and politics from the Catholic University of America in Washington, DC, and an MA in political science and a PhD in urban and public affairs from the University of Louisville. He joined USI in 2010 to serve as the director of the Masters of Public Administration, a position he held for 8 years. Dr. Hanka's research includes housing policy, community development, urban policy and governance, state and local government, strategic planning, and social capital. He has co-authored 12 peer-reviewed articles and given over 40 academic presentations, including the TEDx talk on how to house the chronically homeless. In addition, he is the author of What is Happening, and we will hear today from that book, in Your Community, Why Community Development Matters, published by Lexington Books in 2021. Currently, he is working on a book on the Louisville-Jefferson County, Kentucky merger entitled Merger Dreams, to be published by the University of Kentucky Press. And he's researching a third book on voting rights and statehood in Washington, DC. Dr. Hanka served as a director of the Commission on Homelessness for Evansville and Vanderburgh County, as the former co-chair of Housing Organizations United serving Evansville, and on the Evansville Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee. He also is the former president of the Indiana Political Science Association and the Indiana chapter of the American Society for Public Administration. During the primary and general election seasons, Dr. Hanka provides a commentary on Indiana and Kentucky politics. We may see him on television November 5th. So please welcome Dr. Matt Hanka.
Thank you. Sylvia, thank you everybody for coming. I hope you're all having a great day. It's a beautiful day today. So I'm going to be spending a time talking about my book, What is Happening in Your Community. It's for sale over here. Kind of sums up a lot of the work I've done professionally, both in Louisville, where I did my PhD work, and then a lot of work I've done here through projects through the Center for Applied Research and other kinds of endeavors. So I'm excited to be, thank you very much, Sylvia, for this opportunity to talk about community development, a very important part of society at large. And the Center for Communal Studies is committed to understanding communities. And one of the contributions I hope this makes in terms of our overall discourse of understanding communities is to look at how communities change and solutions on how we can make that change in the present and in the future. As sometimes the field of communal studies has looked at how communities have looked in the past. It's looking forward, and then just some applied sort of solutions on how we can tackle some of those problems as part of the contribution to this book. Before we understand community development, let's understand what a community is. And I teach political science and public administration, and public administration is interdisciplinary. You borrow from a number of disciplines. So when you have an interdisciplinary field, you're going to have a lot of different definitions of the same thing. And so understanding communities and community development isn't any different. So communities, because it has so many things looking at, I found some great definitions of when we talk about community. What does this mean? This unified body of individuals. If you think about this interacting with one another in a common space, location, or place, whether it be physical, spatial, or virtual, that invokes a commonality in which everyone shares particular identities, interests, and experiences. So community, this is a packed definition, but it has a lot of different contexts. We can be in a community that isn't even physical. It can be virtual, and we've experienced a lot of virtual community in certainly in the last 5 years post-COVID, but as long as we've had access to internet, we've been able to enjoy and develop community with people who have common interests, common identities, common experiences for which we can celebrate. Amitai Etzioni, some of you communitarians, he's sort of considered the guru, right, Greg, the kind of the grand poobah of communitarianism. The definition where community is a web of affect-laden relationships among a group of individuals that reinforce one another. So this idea it isn't just you're just not connected and you're flying in the room. It's you reinforce one another, and that this connection you have with others and how you're connected with it and how those connections are reinforced are all based upon a shared commitment to shared values, norms, meanings, history, identity, and culture. So norms, those are sort of behaviors, the things that we think we do, we don't know we're doing it, the values, meanings, history, all these things that have a commonality, or the word community, commune, common. So those are some important ones. So it's thinking about just space and place, and we'll talk a lot about even place making as a way of building community. So it's how do we evoke something that is common and committed to something that's common based upon like ideas, like norms, like values, like histories, like everything. A few others I found that are important. Some of them could be somewhat transactional, where you have a unit of social actors who share similar characteristics socio-demographically, they're in specific areas, about a problem or issue. So you may come together, maybe the commonality and the thing that brings you together is a problem or issue to solve or to address. And so that might bring you together. And it's something that transcends locality of place, whereas you're fighting the fight, you're trying to fight an issue, and you can do that in a community that isn't even here, even virtual. John Dewey, famous philosopher, believed that community was a place where you realized your best version of yourself, the opportunity for self-realization, and the freedom and opportunity to improve oneself as a social being. That's community, to be able to maximize who you are and maximize your full potential, your full everything. And then a very important community person who lives and breathes and sweats it is Wendell Berry. Some of you know Wendell Berry is a farmer in Kentucky, and he believed that it's the mental and spiritual condition and knowing that the place is shared and that people share the place to find and limit the possibility of each other's lives that include knowledge, concern, and trust in each other. So it's this sort of condition for which we are connected by a place that we share. And that all the things that make up what we share define all the possibilities, define who we are based upon what we know about each other, various concerns, and then levels of trust. So the trust being a part of that community that makes it more than just sort of a gathering of individuals at a common one specific point in time, right? There's something deeper than just sort of people hanging out. So if all 40 of us were sitting outside and we're just standing around, are we building community? Well, there would have to be something sort of evoked much deeper than which there's a shared understanding of what we are doing that would promote. So community is extremely important. A community is what we strive for. And part of my book, we talk a lot about the role of intentional communities and the harmonists. So some of you students, have you guys been to New Harmony? You're part of the New Harmony experience. And so the harmonists and the Owenites were two communities who lived there, and they had a shared commitment, but we call that sort of intentional community. So it's specific sort of actions aimed towards a more intentional, deliberate way of living. And there's plenty of intentional communities. There's the Shakers. There's, if you are Catholic, there's the Catholic Workers, and they're about a specific cause. They're about, I don't know if some of you Catholics know about Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker Movement. They are about living the gospel, living it and fighting in every tooth and nail to make sure that the poor are treated with respect and dignity. And I even highlight another Catholic community, the Focolari. It's an Italian movement that promoted unity in doing God's work. So when we talk about that community, what is it about community development that's distinct community? Well, obviously, it's people coming together with a shared purpose, but it's about initiating some level of change in the situation for which they live in, whether it's economic, social, cultural, or environment. Group of people living in a locality that initiates a process, a social action process to change their economic, social, cultural, and environmental situation. So what are we doing in this community to improve and enhance the quality of life? That's community development. Asset building that improves the quality of life among residents of low to moderate income communities. So this gets a little more specific in that it's focused on groups that are in need, and they're based upon a specific income distribution, income bracket, and that it's building upon assets, meaning things that maybe the community has that are strong, or assets they wish to seek to obtain in order to improve and enhance the quality of life of their community. So community development has a number of these different realms that we'll see, and we'll talk about some practical applications. Well, when talking about community development, it's important that if we talk about relationships and people working together in common interest, right, seeking social change, a lot of what gets emerged is this idea of social capital. And social capital has been a room of thought that's emerged over the last maybe 30, 40 years, the 80s. And one man who more or less gave it more publicity than others was Robert Putnam, and he wrote a book called Bowling Alone that talked about the fact that we have as a society, our social capital is eroding. And it's not about techniques on how to bowl, just like Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance isn't really about maintaining your motorcycle either. But people see the book and it's actually somebody, it's a silhouette of somebody holding a bowling ball. It's not a ball. But the idea why the reference is very appropriate is that people are not participating in what we call voluntary organizations, voluntary associations. And a voluntary association could range anything from a block watch group, sewing circle, women's club, or a bowling. So people are not joining and participating in these things that develop social capital. So when we talk about social capital, we talk about the relationships and social networks that exists and the benefits that derive from those relationships and networks, right? So lots of high levels of social capital result from involvement in these voluntary associations. Participating in civic, political, and religious activities promotes a lot of high levels of social capital. And this helps improve the overall health and quality of life of a community that has high levels of social capital. Right? Various kinds of social capital we have are bonding social capital, bridging, and linking. And the bonding social capital is some of those that focus on the strength of ties that people have with close familial relationships or close friends within the same social circle. So if you're in a small village, you're going to have high levels of bonding social capital. If you have ethnically homogenized or even sociodemographically homogenized, sort of like people of sort of like income groups and like socioeconomic status, same social circles, you're going to have high levels of bonding social capital. The bridging social capital is beyond that specific circle, and it's ties with other networks of other groups. And then linking social capital has kind of emerged as one where the ties linking members to these larger organizations, larger voluntary organizations. There was this book that emerged, I didn't have the title with me, but it's a book called Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown. It was written by, actually a number of years ago, the author came to USI to speak, I think in 2015. And the book focuses on kind of sort of that thing, well, they're not talking about gardening, it's talking about why are people not joining these specific organizations, these specific groups. And part of this, Dr. Stafford, his analysis had a lot to do with the communities he studied. He studied Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Youngstown, Ohio. And those are industrial Rust Belt cities. And he wanted to know, why did Youngstown decline and Allentown didn't? And he did a social network analysis and determined that part of Youngstown's problem is it had too much bonding social capital, where no one made ties outside their social circles, outside their economic circles. But in Allentown, the elites, civic elites and others who were running had maintained more networks outside and enhanced and built more what we call bridging social capital. So that bridging social capital is very important because it helps these ties. Well, what do these ties do? These ties, by having this, helps for referring to increases in availability of resources. So when you build these networks outside your neighborhood or outside your social circle group, you have access to the resources. So a lot of economists, when they look at this, they say your transaction costs are reduced if you have higher levels of social capital, because you don't have to worry about a lot of that. So you have more resource availability arising from these broader networks outside your social circle. Can you develop the networks within? Yeah, sure. You have those networks where, Johnny knows Pete, Johnny knows Dave, and Johnny knows Susie, and we're gonna, have fun here and this and that, and everybody knows each other's business in the village and so on and so forth. And when I said village, that was important because Putnam, to kind of build on his bowling alone, he studied a lot of Italian villages in sort of his earlier social capital studies and saw that some of these Italian communities declined. There was no movement, there was no development in a lot of these places because they didn't have this kind of social capital that enabled them to grow. So it's important because if accessing resources, information, and knowledge, it's critical in economic and community development to have high levels of social capital because the benefits that come out of those networks and your relationships you build. If you're sitting there and it's kind of this sort of, you're here and you're waiting for something to happen to you without building those kind of networks, you're not going to get a lot going. You're not going to build those resources. You're not going to be able to not only build, but you're not only also, the important thing is social networks are very helpful for individuals and communities during economic difficulties. So when there's economic decline, when there's things happening, when there could be a natural disaster, you're not waiting for FEMA to come necessarily, or you're not waiting for you're doing a lot to kind of do what you need to do to make sure you have the resources available to get you out of whatever economic or social circumstance you're in. That this helps build with the availability of resources and to be able to do that. Okay. So having those networks, having those resources in that level of social capital at high levels is very important towards enhancing the community quality of life, improving community as during times of economic difficulty and bad economic circumstances. So high social capital is very important, especially high bridging and linking social capital. Okay. So when we talk about community development, there are these themes that sort of emerge as I explored our book. And the three themes are self-help, technical assistance, and common. So the self-help is sort of how it implied, the term implied. It's helping communities helping themselves. So those that practice community development will often act as a facilitator with a very neutral position. And the idea behind self-help is simply just building capacity. Capacity being the skills that are necessary to improve the particular situation in one's life or a community's life. So it's the sort of analogy that sometimes you hear, you're not just giving the fish away, you're teaching how to fish. And you're providing the poles, you're providing the resources and the know-how to go to fish. Not so much, here's a lot of fish. If you've heard that analogy, I know it's probably a tired analogy, but it's that sort of thing. So it's process, it's capacity building, it's a lot of teaching, building leadership skills. That's what we'll learn in some of the community development process we hear. It has a lot to do with the indigenous leadership that exists in a community that can make a difference in how the quality of life is And it's about self-help. It's about doing that and teaching them how to do that. The technical assistance theme of community development has a lot to do with the lack of information. We are a community that just doesn't know what to do. We don't understand what we need to do to improve our circumstance. The idea that when I mean structure determines agency, the idea that the structure behavior of agents are often determined by the structure. And so our behavior is kind of defined by the problem and the circumstance and context that we're in, right? And so a lot of when you use these experts, these advocates, these consultants in community development work, when it's more technical assistance, they're often working for the community rather than with the community. So your self-help, and we're teaching you how to lift yourself up. It's more of a with, it's a more common, whereas this has a little bit more of a relationship of we're doing this for you, as opposed to, and a lot of that with transfer of information. There's that physical intervention. And so it's about technical problem solving. So maybe sometimes people have this unintentionally and not this attitude of, oh, those poor people need some help. Oh man, they just don't know. Well, we'll come in, we'll help, and we'll give them all what we need. And we'll tell them what we think they need. Well, what if the expert doesn't have a clue because they don't know? And they might not know. And all of it has a depending upon what the community wants and needs to improve its quality of life. It doesn't matter what, in many respects, when doing community development right, it's not always what the practitioner itself wants, if that's what the community needs. The community wants the technical expertise. It'll seek it, but there's still a fine line of being able to do it, whereas you get it right. It's about, for the most part, it's about technical problem solving. It's not about capacity building. It's we have a problem, we're going to solve it. Come and solve our problems. Please, pretty please help us. Rather than teaching or at least guiding the community in the self-help model as an approach towards coming up with an appropriate and useful solution. Right? Does that make sense? So this is a kind of interesting story to tell. So this example kind of is rooted in maybe a little bit of both. I was at the University of Louisville, and we did this international service learning program. That's service learning is community development. It's perfect at building capacity to be able to teach students things that you go and serve the community and solve the specific problems. So we were in Belize, and we were in this community. It was Gales Point, and Gales Point was decimated by Hurricane Hattie in 1961. And we were there in the 2000s, and it didn't look like a lot had improved since. Belize is a typical Caribbean country with not a lot of wealth, but it is what it is. Their claim to fame is one of their the famous citizens that became a mayor was one of the first stuntmen of color in Hollywood, and he was in all of the Smokey and the Bandit. Okay, Lincoln McSween. But when we got connection with him, with Mr. McSweeney, in our process of kind of figuring out what to do, and I'll go through some steps of kind of the process we use here. But in just sort of figuring out the ultimate question, what do you do? What do you need to improve and enhance the quality of life of your community? The researchers and folks who worked in the sport management division at U of L, University of Louisville, weren't so much about, they need to know this or that, or maybe, other disciplines were sort of like, oh, they might need this, they might need 10 houses built, they might need a health clinic, they might need all sorts of stuff. You know what the community said they wanted? They wanted a women's softball team. How could you help us get a women's softball team? So I think it's a little bit of, we molded, I think, both self-help and technical assistance in that we provided that. They wanted that. Why did they want that? They saw softball on TV. They saw baseball. The women in the community wanted something that they can do. So, okay, we didn't question it. We didn't judge it. We're going to create and start a women's softball team in this village at Gales Point, Belize. So the technical expertise came to work, where we brought the sport management group, brought people who did international leadership to and then we taught them not only the fundamentals of the game, but taught them how to manage and maintain a softball field. So all the infrastructure and thing necessary to learn how to do this. So we did this, but then with the building of the capacity of you can do this, and even teaching them teaching and coaching techniques. So where those that became the coaches of this team could learn themselves. So we did this, and at the end of our trip, they challenged us to a softball match, softball game, and they won. So that was neat to see a lot of that happen. But that was the beauty of this, that it wasn't us saying, oh, this poor village needs this because we think it needs it. It's basing on what they want, and they were serious about it. And sometimes there's going to be a part of the dialogue where you get to where there's consensus, and they didn't do the process that I'll explain and kind of what we've done in some of it, but there was at least from Mr. McSweeney, Lincoln McSweeney, the stunt man mayor, he had the confidence and of his village that this is what we want. And we did. So that's community development. They could be in all sorts of things based upon asking the fundamental question: what do you need to improve and enhance the quality of life of your community? Not so much of what I think. What do you need? Now, there's a third theme of community development. It goes into what we call the conflict theme. And this is based upon what we know what conflict is. It's behavior, threat by one party directed at another party. Whether it's rights, interests, privileges, actions, whatever. You know, you oppose an action that can be seen as a threat, and that can produce conflict. And conflict is inevitable and exists in our society. But in this sort of context, the problems that exist in a community are rooted in this lack of power. So it's not a lack of information or lack of capacity like the other two. It's we're powerless. The individual is oppressed and powerless. They have no power. You know, this is normative emphasis on justice. Things ought to be this way rather than what they are. So the facilitator isn't this neutral party or this technical expert. This is more of an advocate. This is more of an organizer. Third party is someone who's going to fight for your rights. So you see, if anything with labor organizing or this, that, and the other, it's all about trying to address a problem and organize the community around that problem. So you see the organizers with all the labor unions, you can find all the workers' unions, you know, heck no, we won't go, heck no, we, you know, all the sort of, you know, the protests, the UAW, you saw that recently in sort of the last big labor union protest. A lot of that rooted in, we're going to establish a position because all these people are positions of powerlessness, and we're going to fight for our position. The major champion of this was Saul Alinsky. You may have heard of him. He wrote the book Rules for Radicals, where it's about choosing a problem and then organizing around solving it. So winnable wins, low-hanging fruit, deliverables, those things that you can do to achieve this goal. And it's important to work within existing organizations. So anybody heard of CAGE? CAGE, area of citizens. Okay, that's conflict community development. CAGE is Citizens Congregations Acting for Justice in Evansville. And they're a group that follows this model called the direct action model. And so what they do is they organize a community around a problem and then build consensus around that problem through strategy meetings for organizing to get churches and congregations around a specific problem. So Evansville, Indiana has an affordable housing trust fund, a fund that is designed towards providing assistance to programs to developers, to individuals for low-income housing, for affordable housing, because CAGE was involved in pushing this point forward and moved very quickly towards making sure that those with power heard what they had to say. Right? So it's working with, and a lot of these groups with the conflict model work with an existing organization. So whether it's CAGE or whether it's another sort of group, it works to, you want to work with existing indigenous organizations in a neighborhood. So the cage folks sometimes in that direct action can sometimes be controversial because it's a very confrontational approach to community building and organizing. It's demanding. So if you've ever been to anyone been to Cage? Oh, any of you? Okay. Okay, you've seen this, Peter, right? So what happens is you will have a situation where they'll bring the mayor, Lloyd Winnicky or now Stephanie Terry, and they will go and say, Mayor Winnicky, Mayor Terry, will you promise to increase the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to $2 million? These very specific, pointed, deliberate, intentional questions. And sometimes they'll say yes, and sometimes they'll say no. And sometimes it's not well received by those in the power because they're getting their power like it has its supporters and it has its detractors. Because a lot of this direct action conflict kind of like treats everybody as a herd of sheep, or treats everybody, okay, go get your pitchforks and let's go. And so that can work when it's kind of organizing large groups of people, but the model of being it has its hits and misses too. But it's part of perfect example of conflict. There's some level of conflict and some way of trying to resolve that conflict in a very intentional way. Okay, so this is what the radicals, this is what a lot of folks who are trying to seek collective bargaining and trying to have a strategic advantage try to do. Okay, when we talk about good community development planning and practicing, it's someone who plans with, not for. So they're an astute observer. They understand the lay of the land. They know who's going to be a part. They know who uses a program or community or asset. They know who consumes it. They know these things. They integrate group efforts, so it's not just coming in, even if it's a self-help thing and you've got multiple groups, you're working together with these multiple groups. You know, it's not one sort of taking over everything. It's building leadership skills and group capacity. But then it's also finding a way when you build that capacity, when you're a neutral observer, when you understand what's going on, when you understand organizing or getting people together, a good practitioner will graciously withdraw as the group becomes more self-directed. Ever heard of the book, The Flower Man? Okay, it's a book. Did you ever, with Leadership Everyone, did you ever do those programs? Okay, it's a great little book. It's a picture book without a word, but it tells you everything. It's community development. So it's a book where this guy comes in and he's coming in, he's got that sort of, you know, stick in the bag, you know, like he's Bobo off the train or something. He comes to this community, and the community, the illustrations are profound because when he walks in the community, the illustrations are black and white. Right? He comes in, and it's through picture after picture where he buys a house or gets a house and he sits down, and he in his own way starts to improve this house, while the rest of the homes in his neighborhood community are run down, dilapidated, poor. And as he spruces his dwelling up, you see color. Then he goes and helps a neighbor. And then the neighbor helps another neighbor. And then they get together. And then you start to see more color in the pictures because you get to see more activity and more. It becomes fresher, more vibrant. The community is becoming great. You're seeing activity, you're seeing social capital being built, you're seeing activities outside, and children are playing and they're flying kites and they're selling this and they're doing all these sorts of wonderful things. And you're seeing more and more color through the pages. And then towards the end of the book, as the community, you start to see the old man with the cane, with the stick, just sort of walk out the picture. He leaves when he knows that that community can do it themselves. That's leadership. That's community development. That we know that, yes, you may have guided us to help us, but once you've helped us, we know that we can do this by ourselves. It's not a matter of, you need to know how to do this in your community. I said so, I'm the practitioner, I'm the expert. yes, you are in a way, as I said, with that coming, because there are people who are leaning on that, but it's trying to strike the balance where the expertise is used towards some level of capturing what the community wants and needs. So that expertise of sport management professors and business professors and all that got towards this to say, okay, the community wants this asset and believes. That's community development. So a model that we put together, we call this an adaptive collaborative community transformation model. And this is through work we did with the Center for Applied Research. And I worked with Rhonda Priest on some of the putting together this model. So I'll go through this sort of Willie. So a lot kind of involved, so I'll try to sum a lot of this down. Where when doing this model of community development, you do what we call a pre-initiative phase. And this is getting an organization or individual needing to show that they want to engage in a community revitalization effort. If they don't want to do it, then don't worry about it. But they have to show that, okay, we want to do something about our community. We want to improve and enhance it. They have to demonstrate some level of interest. The second part is a willing leader. You can't just say, hey, we're interested. You need somebody in the community, not the practitioner or the expert. Someone within the community that's a willing local indigenous convener or leader. I'd call a buzzing bee. Somebody who's got a lot of energy, who knows the community, who knows the pulse of it, who owns the groups, knows the constituencies, maybe knows where the bodies are buried, maybe knows maybe knows a lot of those things about the neighborhood, but they know and they've built trust with that neighborhood. And then it's having a support group of people with capacity that will help that informally, help that buzzing. Volunteers who have specific skills in a sort of what we call informal support group. That group will conduct an assessment to learn about this. So even though they may have the knowledge, they still have to dig deeper to figure out what goes on and do an assessment of what really the needs are. And then maybe engage in ethnographic training. I know some folks who sort of do qualitative methods in anthropology and communications and do a lot of ethnographic training. So you probably would want to provide some understanding of training of how to deal with different communities that are different than you. And then you formalize this structure with this convener and leaders and residents, this group that has the capacity and wherewithal to develop this process. So you got this pre-initiative where you understand the problem, you formalize a committee. And one of the things that was successful in this model was in the discussions doing listening sessions using the simplex model. I know you guys know simplex. Actually, are you trained in simplex? Okay, you sort of know it. Okay. Have you ever heard of simplex out there? So simplex, it's the ambassador model. So it's this model of trying to come up with through the various process of problems and solution formulating, engaging in levels of divergence and convergence to be able to come up with appropriate levels of appropriate priorities. So you'd use this method. In fact, in my forward, I had Sue Ellspermann, our former lieutenant governor, do a forward, and part of why I asked her to do, and she accepted to kind of do that. She's not the president of ID Tech, actually outgoing, she's retiring. But Sue worked for the Center for Applied Research. She was the founding director of it, and she left when she became Mike Pence's running mate. When she was lieutenant governor from 2012 2016. And Sue got her PhD at University of Louisville in industrial engineering. And Sue, what she had done was work with a lot of companies on trying to figure out processes in this. And so she got trained in this to kind of apply this to a number of different organizations and the like. So Sue was very instrumental on seeing a lot of this through. And so in addition to kind of those steps and then convergence and divergence, so meaning, and what this has real quickly is they emphasize this sort of zone of deferral of judgment. So when you are putting the ideas and you're throwing ideas, that there's a space, safe space, if you will, where all ideas are out there, all ideas are possible in sort of divergence. So you throw them out there, and then you come back and converge on which are the best ones that we can use as a community that we can build upon, that we can use. So it tries to defer judgment, but then tries to, yeah, because if you were deferring judgment and you're just throwing ideas, you wouldn't get any of that. And while you're doing this sort of simplex, you're doing a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's not just that simple with SWOTs, and I talked about this in my strategic planning class, that you want to make sure when you do a SWOT, you do it thoroughly. So it's not just so much as just strengths by itself in its own silo. You may want to also do a study of how you have strengths, and then what can you do to leverage that to create opportunities? The O part. Or if you have an opportunity, how do you address a threat? Or how does a threat become an opportunity? How does a weakness become a strength? So it's kind of all over the place in terms of it isn't just sort of 2 by 2. So after all of this, after you gathered this data, after you've created ideas in this sort of open space of deferral of judgment with convergence and divergence using these sort of different, where you define the problem, solution, and so on and so forth, you can create a vision and a mission for your community. And this is based upon all that data of what you want that community organization, of what it could be. So a vision is sort of the statement on what it could be versus a mission, which is more of a general statement that tells us what the organization is and how it operates. So vision statements are pithier, shorter. We seek to be this or that. You know, you can look at USIs where the vision is shorter than the mission. And so after you develop what these visions and missions are, Simplex will help you kind of map out what you want in terms of developing goals, objectives, strategies, and metrics to measure those. Right? So in doing this, when we map these out, and then we all come and we will establish, ranking systems on kind of what we want these things to become. You might ask a lot of these how might we questions. So how might we do this? How might we do that? And then you establish your goal, which is a statement on what you want to accomplish in the sort of desired future state. So what do you see your community organization doing 5, 10 years from? Or 5 years, 3 to 5 years, I should say, excuse me. So what does that desired future state look like? That's your goal, right? Your objective's a little more concrete and measurable, linked to your goal that says, okay, in reaching this desired future state, we're going to do this. And then the strategy is going to even be more specific on how we achieve the objective that informs our goals. And then we engage in metrics to be able to, how do we measure those goals, objectives, and strategies? And so what happens is when we can come together and we create these goals, we don't sit back and just let the goals and say, oh, we developed a strategic plan, our work is done. And that's sometimes a pitfall of strategic planning, where you do all that. Some of you may have been in strategic planning processes where, oh, we did this, it's fun, it's cool, we got our 3 to 5 goals, I feel better about myself, I feel better about my job, and then it sits on a shelf. Well, communities can't afford for these things to sit on a shelf. So an intentional part of this Simplex process that we used with Center for Applied Research was putting priority teams around these goals so that there's ownership in these goals and identifying the specific people who want to be a part of this. So if you're interested in building IT infrastructure, or you're interested in building cultural competence, and your cross-cultural competence, that's what you're passionate about, you might be identified by the buzzing bee. Dr. Berg, we want you to lead the cross-cultural competence goal, just as an example. Or any of those sorts of things, all based upon what community comes up with. And this is a deferral of judgment, and this is a facilitator who is not injecting any of his or her opinions whatsoever. It is an objective judgment based upon highly specialized training using this method that has worked. Sometimes it's about the training, sometimes it's about the method, and there have been some times if the practitioner comes in and does some things and they impose it, Sometimes the passion isn't there. Everybody has to organically buy into this. And identifying those important people that will lead those priorities teams based on those goals is a big part of the success. They're going to be the local drivers. They're going to be the organizations. They're going to be the drivers that will own those goals. And then afterwards, you always want to have a research component. Yeah, I know people have to research everything up, you know. Us professors, academics, everything's got to be researched. But with this, it's important that you are doing a needs assessment, not just to identify the problem, as I said, but how through surveys and focus groups, how are we carrying out these goals and objectives and strategies. So it's important to kind of do it on that too. Here's an example of Jacobsville that did a comprehensive community development effort. And one of the things the community wanted to do was a zero around kind of improving quality of life and improving educational outcomes. And one of the things they've done is develop what's called, mostly within this frame, called the Jacobsville Kids Zone. So there is this model that had been used called the Harlem Children's Zone. Maybe some of you have heard of Harlem Children's Zone. It's a zone. So the founder of this group, Jeffrey Canada, decided to take 97 blocks of Harlem, which is in upper Manhattan, and decide to create a program that focused on cradle to career. So what I mean cradle to career, from the moment you're born to the moment you get a high school or college diploma, there will be a program that will be there to provide programs and services, wraparound services through childcare, through training, through education. And so the Jacobsville people saw the model and brought it back here. And so there've been positive outcomes associated in terms of educational attainment, in terms of improved reading scores. And the other one they did was in the east end of Henderson through a project called the Audubon Kids Zone. So these were the goals. I don't have the ones of the Jacobsville, but these are the ones of the Audubon Kids Zone. So they got together and did all the process I've been talking about and say, we want to do 5 things. We want to be kid-centric. We want 0 through college, that cradle to career pipeline. So we're going to work with you from the moment you're born until you graduate. Metrics matter in terms of we're going to be able to have that sort of piece where we can measure our progress, and then have neighborhood support. And then while we're doing it, we're teaching you the capacity of being good citizens, being good stewards to your community, etc. So it's not just giving you the tools, but it's teaching you how to even teach others, teaching you how to become the best version of yourself too, equipping you with the character skills to be able to contribute to the future of your community as well. So that's the beautiful thing about these things being cyclical too. Kind of cool. Now I talk a little bit about collective impact, which has a little bit of a difference to comprehensive community development, but it is a way of kind of achieving social impact. And I'll give some examples in the next few minutes on collective impact. So conditions must be met, and you see some overlap on this, but there's a sort of distinct literature to some of this, and that you can do collective impact without it being communities specific. But it's having a common agenda, a shared vision for change, shared measurements. We're all measuring the same thing to understand what we need. Mutually reinforcing activities that reinforce what we're trying to do. Continuous communication and backbone support. So it's hard to engage in any of these initiatives without that backbone organization that's providing it. So even in the examples I gave earlier, you wouldn't be able to do Audubon Kids Zone if you didn't have the support of One Life Church and the schools. You wouldn't be able to do a lot of the Jacobsville without the Dream Center, without Delaware Elementary and those sorts of, and I get into the details there. But you need that support, you need communication, and you need to be able to know what you're doing and being able to measure that appropriately. You need that influential champion, you need enough financial resources, and you need a sense of urgency for change in doing collective impact. 2 examples I'm going to share with you are the voice visioning process. Did anybody do this a couple of years ago? For those in the, so when the Bear Winnicke became mayor, He went to Lynn Miller Pease, some of you may know her in the community of leadership Evansville, not leadership everyone, and said, I'd like to do a community visioning. And they said, we will do this. And so it emerged from about 2013, 2015, a series of conversations, series of meetings that involved 1,700 people that got together to figure out what do we want to do to improve our community? What do we want to do to make it better? And so they engaged in this voice visioning process, visioning outcomes, inspiring community engagement. Now, what did they do to get to that as a part of the pre-initiative part of getting the ideas going? They have these sessions, they're very interesting, where they brought everybody in. They said, okay, we want you to figure out give us some things that are wrong with Evansville. What are some things that you think that are negative about Evansville that you don't like? And then through an analysis of all these different meetings, they created a word cloud that you see up there. These are the things that the people participating didn't like. The negativity, you probably heard this. You live in Evansville? Why? You hear these things. You hear a lot about the poverty in our community. Evansville does have a lot of poverty. Racism, the racism issues. Bullying, drugs, homelessness. We've got a lot of homeless in Evansville for our size. But then they asked, okay, what would you like to take away, move away from? And then what would you like to do to carry forward? Discard all that. What would you like to carry forward for the future of your community? What are some positive things? School system, friendliness, opportunities, welcoming. It's diverse. These are the things they identified that are very specific. They're very positive about our neighborhood, about our community. Okay. So out of this emerged these word clouds, and what emerged were a series of projects they called flower pots. And one was focused on green spaces. The other was focused on experiences. And so a lot of the events you've seen locally, Parks Fest, a lot of those things have emerged because these goals out of this collective impact process was about experiences. The cultural district of downtown in Haney's Corner, we want experience. We want spaces, we want places for which we can emerge. So that was a perfect example of coming out of these things. And it didn't do a strategic plan, like you say, it just sort of emphasized that these are things that the community can do. And there were measurements and supports behind that. Well, a little more nuanced than this, a little bit more better data gathering was another one called the Promise Zone. Some of you may have heard of Promise Zone. So the Promise Zone got a designation, the city of Evansville got a designation because of a lot of areas that are high poverty, 35 to 50%. So they have Promise Zones throughout the country. We were one of 22 that were chosen, but we were one of only 2 that was chosen to be convened by something other than the municipal government. So Echo Housing and Community Development is the organization that leads and convenes this, not the city. The city employs people that work with them, but they're not the driver. And this is the Promise Zone. So it's carved, it is a little sort of gerrymandered, but these are the highest poverty areas of Evansville. 35 to 50% those are living below the federal poverty. A lot of these are sort of going to be in your area of downtown, south side, southeast side. Okay? So you may not see this, but one of the goals we had about the goals were to increase affordable housing. So one of the things I wanted to highlight in this was just the goals that we set in terms of what are we going to do to improve the situation. And so the collective impact, when I said the backbone support, that's Echo Housing. So how we measure the goals that we're trying to do, one of the goals is affordable housing. As we wanted a 30% reduction in the number of blighted properties by 2026. And I should say 2026 because that's the end of the 10-year designation. And we said we want 250 new units built by 2026, and we surpassed that in the first couple of years. Permanent supportive housing. This is housing that supports the chronically homeless. we almost met that goal in 3 or 4 years. Numbers of families receiving services, we were halfway there in the first 2 years. So we were able, through Deal Consulting with Dan Deal, some of you may know in the community, be able to measure this support, measure this impact we were trying to make through continuous communication, through backbone support, and through shared understanding. Okay. Another instance of us talking about role of community development is building housing. You can't do housing without community development, but you can't do community development without housing. They go hand in hand. Some folks who see the picture, see the housing, and that's why that's not meant to be a cute statement, that sometimes it happens. Where you might build the house and you're building the house, but what have you done to enhance the community? And then if you're trying to enhance the community, a solution is always going to be having enough places for people to live. Because there aren't enough places for people to live. We have a deficit, we have a shortage. That's why housing goes hand in hand. Of any kind of strategy you're going to do, you'd want to include housing. Well, the federal government created this program called Hope 6, Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere. And this was based upon a study done, commission that was convened by Jack Kemp, who was the HUD secretary under George H.W. Bush administration, and said that 6 to 7% of our housing is severely distressed, uninhabitable. You wouldn't want you or your loved ones to live in these houses. And that's a big part of our housing stock. So this is the federal government's way of changing its course on public housing, that for 50+ years, it had done a lot to build sort of basic monolithic structures without any appeal, that were just magnets of crime and poverty. And so they tore down all the public housing, reducing the concentration of poverty. So you were building and seeing in these bigger cities public housing that were warehouse, 23-story building. Why? Because the public housing people took on an idea that they misunderstood. And Andy knows about Le Corbusier, and a lot of the Soviet style Le Corbusier influenced Soviet style housing, right? Well, Le Corbusier is a French architect who thought we could build skyscrapers to house everybody. Well, that was old housing that became the future. So yesterday's dynamic housing became the housing of the poor and became the projects. And so changing all of that was extremely important. So it's trying to reduce the concentration of poverty. But the thing about this is not just changing the physical shape, it's providing support services. So it's back to that. It's back to that. Yes, I'm giving you the fish, but you need the pole too, and I need to teach you how to fish. Yes, you might need to pull you the bootstraps, but you need some boots. It's not enough to give you the home. Part of Hope 6 was aiming you wrap around community and supportive services so that you could become self-sufficient. So you could become members of a community, that you are contributing to its quality of life. And so that added a unique dynamic thing. How much time more time?
We actually have two.
Okay. So I'll wrap this up with new urbanism as being a part of this Hope 6 model. What can we do to make neighborhoods better? Reduce the traditional urban reinvest in the traditional urban form, and allow things to happen that they're more compact. So all these buildings that we built with Hope 6 took down the old public housing and made them new based upon walkability. This is in Newport, Kentucky. Park benches, or porches, excuse me. Everything's walkable. Everything's integrated. Everything's compact. Everything's livable, sustainable, everything green. So instead of everybody, this is Newport, where everybody was housed down by the river, tore down all that public housing and they built it throughout town. One example real quick is this is an old church, Corpus Christi, the body of Christ in Latin. that was converted into apartments in this Hope 6 project. This is the lobby of a converted Catholic church into these units that were affordable, that were a part of this model. So real quickly, with taking out the old physical public housing, creating supportive services, but then building them through either new housing or adaptive reuse housing. How would you like having all that? Pretty cool. And it helped enhance social capital as well. Okay, are we out of time? Okay. We're out of time.
We're out of time.
Okay, any questions, or do we have any time for any questions, or?
Yes, I mean, first of all, thank you.
Yeah.
Hard to talk about everything.
If there are any questions, please. One back here.
Just a question, we haven't done a lot of activism for a long time, but they did right through the most sense, is people show up with a list of demands, and they're like, okay, now you go do what I want, right? So how do you, and they're not gonna come back and show up and actually try to make it happen, right? How do you factor in when you're trying to do community development, the people who are actually, when you're doing that vision session and asking people what they want, to what extent can you trust what they're telling you on the ground, right? Are those the people that are gonna show up again? Are they just saying this because they read your website that constantly flashes on their social media that says this is what you should want, right? Like you said, it should be like objective and really giving people what they want. But a lot of times, like who are the people? What do they want? How do I know? Like, how do you?
Okay, that's a great point, because I think what it is you don't want to be somebody who's spying on your neighbors, you know, to kind of, but my understanding from what came out of the East End Henderson project, they called it Engage Henderson, I forgot to mention the name, and Jacobsville and Glenwood, was that the convener knew the community well enough, and those people, that they did some follow-ups with them on some of those points. And that if they never saw that person, they never saw that person again. But the ones that they know that were credible in the community, they did a lot more sort of following up with them, that so that they were coming out with the best, most, so it wasn't, if someone was giving them a load of nonsense, well, they would know that because of.
Nonsense, I just mean like so many people want to show up with a list of demands.
Right.
And they have no intention of making anything happen, right? Like you need the people who are gonna do the work.
Right.
To share the goals, like what part of the methodology, I mean, I guess you're just saying you have to have someone who.
So, and I think it gets filtered out of the choosing process, because if you have a list of demands and no one, this is kind of, I think, group dynamics. If you have a list of demands and no one knows who you are they gonna make the top priorities of people when the group itself chooses who the top five priorities they want for their community? Are they necessarily gonna choose that? A lot of times it's based upon kind of trust that's developed in that community, where that voice might, you know, okay, that's just someone talking, but if they can develop a consensus, you know, and everyone thinks that that's the best approach, then you know, a lot of times these things happen organically, where you can come to a consensus based upon one of that, even if there is somebody that has demands. I think if that person shows up and never comes back, there have been follow-ups that have been done, but sometimes if they don't show up, they don't show up. Did I answer? I'm trying to make sure I answered. Did I? It's kind of along those lines of just following the process. And I think another thing I should say about that is the facilitator might parse that person apart and try to figure out ways where they're not dominating either. You know, a skilled facilitator is one that's not going to let that happen too.
Yeah, but this is somewhat related to what Marilyn was saying, is that I've looked at people trying to bring in innovations or changes to communities.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, the people who end up showing up, doing the work, end up being like already fairly well off, middle-class people who have the time and the resources to do this. And then the people from the community are trying to, they might not have as much, time to do it because of work or other pressures. And so I guess that's the question of like, how do you balance that, because someone who you want to have ally, but then they may not actually be.
I think it's just, it's continuously trying to get those people that will be at the table. I know that's not a guarantee, but it's not giving up. And I think in Glenwood, excuse me, they didn't give up. They had somebody, and then not only did they have, I should have mentioned this with Glenwood. Glenwood had a community, not just the Buzzing Bee convener who came from Habitat, but the neighborhood association president who could rely. So if you have more than one trusted voice, that can matter too. You don't want to discount the ones that have the wherewithal too. And I know it sometimes happens. It's an effective convener is not going to let them dominate. They're always going to find the people that need to be a part of that process. And if it doesn't happen that way, I mean, are there instances where it doesn't happen that way? I'm sure just as human nature, it isn't, but it's not without an intentional effort by the convener and by the steering committee to make sure that all parties are heard. And if they're not heard at those meetings, that's where you have focus groups and other surveys and door to door to get a lot of that too. Did I answer yours? Did I answer all yours, Mary Lynn? I understood your question. I mean, okay, yeah.
When was the Henderson program? Year?
2015, 2019. Rob Carroll, who's an education professor here, was involved in that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So much.
Carrie, could we see how many people were on there? That was it.